Okay, let's dive in. You might have seen the headlines buzzing recently about a potential pretty serious trade spat between the U.S. and the EU.
Yeah, definitely.
Lots of talk about major tariffs, a real sort of jittery feeling in the markets, and then almost out of the blue, a delay. It felt like things went from boiling right down to simmering, didn't it?
Exactly. And that sudden shift, that moment of intense threat followed by this pause, well, that's really what our deep dive is focusing on today. We're using a specific piece from CNBC as our guide here, the one titled, Trump Delays EU Tariffs, but More Volatility Could Be on the Way.
Right. And our mission, like always, is to kind of cut through the noise. We want to use this source to help you quickly get a handle on what the article says actually went down, why this whole situation is still a big deal for market watchers, even with the delay, and crucially, what the article suggests is still, up in the air.
Basically get the key insights without getting bogged down.
Precisely. So you get the important bits fast.
Right. And the article, it kind of sets the scene by reminding us of the original threat. President Trump had put forward a pretty hefty tariff 50% duty on EU goods, and the initial timeline mentioned in the source was for this to kick in quite soon, June 1st.
Wow, 50%. That's a big number.
Yeah.
Did the article explain the reasoning behind such a large threat?
It does quote President Trump directly on that. The reason given was that the bloc was proving very difficult to deal with and that trade talks were, in his view, going nowhere. That kind of strong language, plus the high tariff figure, it definitely got people's attention.
Oh, I bet it did. But then things changed. The article goes into the pivot, right? After a call, specifically with the EU Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, that June 1st date got pushed back.
Yeah, not canceled, but delayed. The new date mentioned is July 9th.
Okay, a delay. And that's a key development the article highlights. What about von der Leyen's reaction? How did the source frame her take on this extra time?
Well, her quoted response gives us the EU angle. She cited saying the EU is ready to advance talks swiftly and decisively. And she stressed that they needed that time until July 9th specifically to reach a good deal. She also made a point of underlining the importance of the relationship, calling it the world's most consequential and close trade relationship.
So framing it as a constructive window, like, okay, let's use these 6 weeks productively. The article also mentions it wasn't just that one call, right? Something about ongoing contact.
It notes that the European Trade Commissioner, Maros Sefcovic, had apparently had good calls with the U.S. Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick. And the plan, according to the source, was to continue to stay in constant contact.
So that detail suggests the communication lines are still open, at least. Active diplomacy happening.
Yes, that's the picture the report paints. Ongoing efforts behind the scenes.
Okay, so you've got this sequence. Big threat, sudden delay after a key phone call, promises to keep talking. How did the markets react to all this? The article must have touched on that immediate reaction.
Oh, absolutely. The market reaction described is pretty telling. Apparently, European stocks had taken a bit of a dive, sinking on the Friday when those tariff threats were really loud.
Right.
But then the article says they bounced back quite strongly on Monday morning, moving into positive territory almost right after the delay was announced.
It's amazing how sensitive they are, isn't it? Just the delay, not even a cancellation, was enough for that kind of rebound. Does the article kind of explain why even just a pause is such a relief?
Well, it doesn't spell it out explicitly, but it clearly shows that markets just hate uncertainty. So pulling back from that immediate June 1st deadline, even if it's just temporary, it steps back from the brink of a potential trade war, which markets obviously see as a negative.
Makes sense.
But, like the CNBC headline warns, that doesn't mean the volatility is finished. The article then really digs into why market watchers are still saying, a lot remains at stake, even with this pause.
Okay, so the delay bought some breathing room? Maybe. But the underlying issues haven't gone away. The source quotes a few analysts on this. Let's start with Holger Schmeiding, the chief economist at Berenberg. What's his perspective on this new 6-week window leading up to July 9th?
He's quoted saying it's likely probably not enough time to settle all detailed questions, which, seems fair for such a complex relationship.
Yeah.
However, he does feel it should be enough time to actually agree on the basic framework of a trade deal.
And what does Schmeiding see as the key ingredient needed to actually get that framework agreed upon in just 6 weeks?
This is where his view really comes across in the article. He calls it basically a matter of political will, and that depends a bit on the U.S. side. So for him, it's less about the nitty-gritty details right now and more about the top-level political decision to actually strike a deal.
Political will.
He even sketches out possible scenarios, if that will is there. Maybe something like the US-UK deal, potentially involving a 10% US tariff, but crucially with hardly any EU retaliation, and then they'd sort out the finer points later.
That sounds relatively smooth, if the will exists. But what's the flip side? What if the U.S. does push ahead with really high tariffs? What does Schmeiding think happens then?
Well, he warns that if the U.S. were to go for a higher sort of blanket tariff, maybe 20 or 30%, the article quotes him saying the EU would have no choice but to bring in significant countermeasures.
Retaliation.
Exactly. He apparently describes Trump as an interesting negotiator who uses shock tactics, but he doesn't think the EU will just, fold or capitulate. His advice for the EU, as reported in the source, is to stay calm and negotiate as equals, basically remembering their own market power and importance to the U.S.
Okay, so Schmeiding outlines two paths. A possible framework deal based on political will, or a definite risk of escalation if the tariffs are high. That's one view focusing on political will. Did the other analysts quoted look at different hurdles?
Yeah, they brought slightly different angles. Guntram Wolff, who's a senior fellow at Bruegel, he really emphasizes the ongoing uncertainty. He calls it massive uncertainty. He's quoted saying it's bad for business, it's bad for consumers, and frankly, it's an unnecessary step.
And what does he see as the main sticking point right now? Is it also political will for him?
Not quite. For Wolff, as the article presents it, the biggest problem is that it's very unclear what exactly the U.S. president wants. He points out this frustration exists, even though apparently the EU has made offers, has made proposals. So his point is more about how can you effectively negotiate if the other side's objectives aren't really clear.
Ah, okay, so that's a different kind of challenge. Clarity of goals, not just the will to achieve them. How does Wolff rate the EU's handling of this situation so far?
He seems to think the EU is playing it rather well, actually. He describes their approach as taking a middle path, and he contrasts this with what he sees as the UK's approach, giving in on all kinds of demands, and China's really escalated. The EU, in his view, according to the article, is trying to navigate between those extremes, not escalating, but not just giving in either.
Interesting. A middle path. And does he think the EU actually has the power to push back? If that path doesn't work out, can they retaliate effectively?
Oh, definitely. The source quotes him confirming the EU does have capacity to retaliate. He specifically points to things like pharmaceutical products, which are very important for the U.S., and also potential leverage in the services sector.
Right.
However, he notes that the EU so far has decided not to do it, deliberately trying to keep a climate of de-escalation. But he poses the question in the article, is this approach going to be enough now? Will that restraint continue to work?
It's fascinating how both Schmeiding and Wolff see the EU could retaliate, but they frame the immediate problem differently, political will versus clarity of goals. Okay, let's bring in the third analyst the article mentions, Naeem Aslam from Zaya Capital Markets. He sounds like he's really focused on the market side of things.
He absolutely is. Aslam calls that market rebound we talked about earlier a tentative risk-on rally. Tentative being the key word there. And he echoes the others. Despite the delay, he says, much remained at stake.
Tentative risk on rally. Yeah, that definitely sounds cautious. What does he flag as the next critical point in time?
He points straight to July 9th as the next flashpoint. And probably my favorite description from the whole article, he calls the entire situation a high-stakes tango.
A high-stakes tango. That captures the back and forth perfectly, doesn't it? How does he describe the tension in this tango leading up to July 9th?
The article quotes him contrasting the two sides' approaches. He describes the EU as dangling phased tariff cuts and mutual respect talks, sort of the diplomatic approach, and he pits that against Trump's America First bravado.
Okay.
And his worry is that this clash of styles could turn the negotiations into less of a dance and more of a, well, he calls it a slugfest.
A slugfest. Oof. And what happens if it does become a slugfest, according to Aslam? What are the consequences?
Well, in his view, from the source, that kind of negotiation could seriously rattle supply chains and also fan inflationary flames. So real economic impacts. He also flags specific sectors he thinks are particularly exposed, noting tech and industrials are particularly braced for whiplash.
Right. So he's directly linking the way they negotiate to potential supply chain chaos, maybe higher prices, and hitting specific industries hard.
Yeah.
How does he see markets behaving as we get closer to that July 9th date?
He puts it pretty bluntly. Markets will hang on every tweet and trade talk whisper. Investors, he says, are basically stuck wondering whether this delay is a genuine olive branch or just Trump reloading for a bigger tariff showdown. It just highlights how much uncertainty is driven by the communication, the signals, the perception.
That uncertainty really comes through in the article, doesn't it? And his final line, quoted in the source, it really sums it up.
Yeah, it's a memorable warning about the ongoing volatility. Buckle up. This ride's far from over.
Hold up. Yeah, that's definitely not a sign that everything's resolved. Okay, so let's bring this all together for you, the listener. If we synthesize what we've pulled from this CNBC piece, what are the absolute core takeaways from this deep dive?
Well, what we've seen is a major tariff threat was put on ice, temporarily. That gave the markets some relief, but as the source makes really clear, the fundamental disagreements, the core issues, they're still very much there.
Right.
And we heard from different analysts who gave varied takes on the hurdles ahead, whether it's really about political will or maybe a lack of clarity on goals or just the risk of economic damage depending on how the talks go. But the common thread is huge uncertainty and high stakes.
And this really matters because, as those analysts pointed out, this whole US-EU trade situation isn't just some abstract policy debate. It affects global markets, it affects businesses, it could impact supply chains, how easy and cheap it is to get goods, and potentially even the prices you pay for things that cross the Atlantic. It really shows how linked everything is, how high-level trade policy filters down.
Absolutely. The delay bought time, but the source hammers home that the basic tension is unresolved. And the stakes are still incredibly high as we look towards that July 9th deadline and maybe even beyond it.
It really does make you think, doesn't it? When you consider what those analysts focused on, Schmeiding talking about political will, Wolf about the lack of clear U.S. goals, Aslam worrying about negotiation styles turning into a slugfest, you have to wonder, how much does the outcome of these massive trade talks depend more on those sort of human factors? You know, the political strategy, the clarity of purpose, the negotiation tactics, rather than just the economic data or the detailed proposals on the table.
Yeah, it seems, based on this source anyway, that the how of these negotiations might end up being just as critical as the what.